There are still some concerns surrounding the highly anticipated roguelike that is set to release within the next few weeks. From ambitious world generation to overall game feel, Hyper Light Breaker has raised some hesitations. So I think we should take a look at the 4 most common criticisms about the game and see if there truly is a reason to be concerned. One of the biggest hesitations so far about Hyper Light Breaker is arguably one of its biggest selling points: the infinite open worlds made possible by procedural generation. Procedural generation has been adopted by many games, some of which have succeeded in making a great experience. But when we first hear the words procedural generation, it's hard not to think of the many games that ultimately ended up with worlds that were devoid of life and creativity. And the surprising thing is, these are actually not the concern of Hyper Light Breaker's use of procedural generation. In fact, most of the players who've had a chance to test the game have said that the worlds feel absolutely immersive and bursting with life. The concern, however, is how the world generates. There's been instances where buildings are meshed together and their doors are inaccessible. Another player said that when he was on a quest that required him to reach the top of a mountain, the only path up was blocked by an impassable boulder. It goes without saying that the procedural generation blocking important pathways is an absolute valid concern. The last thing you want is to be on a god run only to find that the path to the final boss is blocked. Sure, infinite open worlds sounds really cool, but only if they are 100% playable from start to finish. But the one positive note that I will say is that the demo which was presented for testing was an older version of Hyper Light Breaker, a version that the developers said had several major kinks, but was good enough to portray the feel of the game. So I believe that we can have a little bit of faith that when the final version of Hyper Light Breaker, through the many delays, finally releases, it will have a map generation system that will be effective in preventing these kinds of issues. Because honestly, the success of the game really depends on it. Now let's shift our focus away from the generation of the world and focus a little bit more on the player's movement around the world. The mobility mechanics will be some of the most utilized in the game due to the sheer amount of exploration around the massive world. The player will have a few gadgets in their arsenal to help with traversal, most notably a hoverboard. The main use of the hoverboard will be to help players get from point A to point B, whether that is an exfiltration point before dark or a gate to the next boss fight. But there has been a concern with the hoverboard by many players, and that is the speed. Players have said that it seems sluggish and feels like the speed should be increased by a considerable amount. Now I will agree that with some of the gameplay shown, the hoverboard speed doesn't seem overwhelming. But I would like to remind everyone that there are many aspects of Hyper Light Breaker that we still don't know, and that includes the meta progression. I feel like the hoverboard speed not only seems like something that you could further increase by upgrades, but would actually be better off this way, and I'll explain why. The developers have stated many times that they want their players to spend time exploring throughout the world that they work so hard to create. They don't want them to just fly through it at hyperspeed right from the start. Also, there are fast travel points scattered across the world. The hoverboard just simply isn't meant to be your main form of travel through long distances. But hey, even if I'm wrong about the hoverboard speed being upgradable, I did find this clip of gameplay on Discord that looks a lot like a boost ability on the hoverboard, so at least we'll have that. The last two concerns, we can essentially group them together because they kind of revolve around the same thing: how the game looks and feels. The first concern comes from fans of Hyper Light Drifter, as they feel the gameplay is too much of a departure from the original. While the second concern comes from other players who believe that Hyper Light Breaker looks too similar to Risk of Rain 2. And for the Drifter fans, I can see where the concerns are coming from. Hyper Light Drifter is a beloved 2D pixel art adventure game with a deep narrative. The developer Heart Machine essentially traded the 2D pixel art for a stylized 3D world, and ultimately going from a game with a story that had very defined beginning and end to a game with infinite beginnings and endings. And while these are true, I do want to stress that the developers have been very vocal that Hyper Light Breaker is not a sequel to Drifter. It is its own game with a unique experience that is simply in the same universe. And while it's your right to be upset about these changes being made, understanding that this isn't a sequel is important. For the Risk of Rain 2 comments, I suppose this is less of a concern and more just mere comparisons, though some diehard Risk of Rain fans are pretty upset over the similarities. I do want to discuss it because while they may have similar color palettes and they're both roguelites, that's pretty much where the similarities end. For starters, Breaker is an open world game that focuses on extracting resources to help you in future runs. Risk of Rain 2 is a level-based roguelike that focuses on collecting gear and getting to the next stage as quickly as possible. The level design is also extremely different, as Breaker is procedurally generated, while Risk of Rain 2 has a few variations of each stage that are randomly chosen for each run. The gameplay of each game is also fairly different, as Risk of Rain is heavily dependent on character choice, as each character has preset abilities that will remain the same through the entire run. Breaker, on the other hand, while characters have unique abilities, the gameplay will constantly be changing depending on the gear that you find and equip throughout your run. There are plenty more differences in both games, but I think you get my point. And I want to be clear, none of these reasons make one game better than the other, but it's hard to argue with the fact that the two have quite a few differences. In all, I think these initial concerns are valid, but with many of them, it's just simply too early to make any final judgments, especially since the game hasn't even released yet. But hey, everybody has concerns. Even the procedural generation quirks caught my attention for a bit. But that is something that the developers can iron out through early access if they haven't already. And maybe you have some concerns too. I'd be really interested in hearing about it so we can discuss if it's really something that we should be worried about. Anyways, that's it for this one. I appreciate you for sticking around, and thanks for watching.